Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're heading somewhere cold. Not just a little chilly, not sweater weather cold. The kind of cold that crawls into your bones, laughs at your blanket, and dares you to survive until morning. Before we start, do me a small favor. Only if you feel like it. Hit that subscribe button if these quiet walks through forgotten corners of history help you drift off a little easier. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing those tiny dots of warmth lighting up the world in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe pull your blanket a little tighter. If you have a cup of something warm nearby, take a slow sip. Because tonight, we're going back in time. Back to a world where warmth was a luxury, not a guarantee. This is the story of the medieval peasant, the farmer, the thatcher, the shepherd, the millions who lived their entire lives in a war against winter. They weren't knights in shining armor or nobles feasting beside roaring hearths. They were the ones shivering just outside the castle walls, clutching a fading fire and hoping their children didn't wake up blue. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we picture grand feasts, glittering halls, candles glowing against polished stone. But the real Middle Ages were quieter, smokier, and much, much colder. For the average peasant, winter wasn't a cozy storybook season. It was a yearly test of endurance, a long, freezing question that began in November and didn't end until spring whispered mercy. The cold arrived early back then. There were no weather apps, no forecasts, no feels like -5. You just woke one morning to find the ground stiff beneath your feet and the air biting at your lungs. The last of the harvest was already sealed away in clay jars, and from that moment forward, survival meant rationing, patching, and praying. The cold didn't knock politely on the door. It came in through the walls. Peasant homes were made of what you could find, wood if you were lucky, mud and straw if you weren't. They were built fast, repaired constantly, and insulated only by hope and livestock. The moment the temperature dropped, the wind began whispering through every crack, stealing heat faster than you could make it. Inside, the family huddled around the hearth, that little smoky pit of salvation. A few burning logs might give off just enough light to see your own breath. Children wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they had. Dogs curled close, and someone always muttered the same line, "At least we're not outside." And outside? Well, outside was another world entirely. The roads froze solid, the fields turned to glass, and the night stretched forever. The countryside went silent, except for the wind. Even the birds disappeared. The only movement came from desperate animals, or travelers so unlucky they hadn't found shelter before dusk. Imagine that silence. No humming electricity, no traffic, no distant city lights. Just the faint pop of the fire, the hiss of your own breath, and the sound of cold creeping through the roof. You could feel winter pressing on you from all sides, through your boots, your fingers, even the air in your lungs. It was like living inside a refrigerator that sometimes growled. There were no soft beds, no goose-down blankets, no central heating. What warmth you had, you earned with your hands, chopping wood, tending fires, sealing gaps with straw, and layering the same worn wool tunic day after day until it could probably stand up on its own. But peasants weren't helpless. They were clever, stubborn survivors. Over generations, they developed little tricks, small acts of genius that kept life possible when it should have frozen solid. They learned how to trap heat, how to breathe slowly to keep their lungs from burning, how to store food that wouldn't rot even in freezing huts. They didn't have thermometers, but they knew cold in every shade and flavor. Winter, to them, wasn't a single season. It was a series of battles, the first against hunger, the second against illness, the last against despair. And every small victory, a lit fire, a warm meal, a night without frostbite, felt monumental. Still, the nights were endless. Darkness fell early and didn't lift for what felt like weeks. People learned to measure time not by days, but by how many logs remained by the fire. The bravest among them ventured outside to fetch more wood, trudging through knee-deep snow, their breath catching like smoke in the moonlight. The rest stayed huddled inside, whispering stories or prayers or both. Sometimes they talked about the saints, which one protected fingers, which one watched over the hearth. Sometimes they told old folk tales about winters that never ended and heroes who tricked the frost itself. But mostly they just sat quietly, letting the fire do the talking, because when the wind roared, it felt alive, as if the world outside the walls was breathing, angry and awake. Roofs creaked, the door rattled, the whole hut trembled like it might give up at any moment, and yet, somehow, it held. That's the strange magic of peasant life. Everything looked fragile, but nothing actually broke. Mud, straw, wood, smoke, faith. It was all barely enough, and somehow enough all the same. So tonight, as we step through their world, we'll uncover how they did it, how they turned dirt into shelter, smoke into warmth, and hopeless nights into survival. Each part of their life, from the walls to the floors, from the fire to the bed, was a small piece of a larger miracle. By the end of this journey, you'll see winter through their eyes. You'll feel what it meant to fight for warmth, to share breath with your family, to wake each morning in disbelief that you made it through another night. For now, let's pause here. Take a breath, feel the weight of your blanket, the heat of your room, and imagine it all gone. That's where our story begins, in the coldest nights of medieval life, when warmth was a dream and survival was the only prayer. So, you've made it through the first night. Congratulations, you're still alive and probably only half frozen. Now, let's step inside your medieval home, if home is even the right word. It's more like a very determined pile of sticks that refuses to blow away. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. A low shape squatting in the mud, patched with straw, maybe leaning a little to one side like it gave up on good posture long ago. The walls are made of something called wattle and daub, which sounds fancy until you realize it's just sticks woven together and smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Think of it as nature's version of concrete. If concrete could catch fire and smell like your barn. Step closer. You'll notice the roof, a thick layer of thatch, reeds, or whatever plant was most available that year. It looks picturesque now in paintings, golden and soft under the sun. But in reality, it leaked every time it rained and served as a 5-star hotel for mice, spiders, and occasionally the local snake. When the snow piled up too high, the roof sagged like a tired old man's back. Still, it was all you had between you and the angry sky. Now let's duck inside. No doorbell, of course, just a heavy wooden plank or animal hide hanging from a crooked hinge. When it closes, you don't hear a comforting click. You hear a sigh, like even the door is tired of winter. Inside, the air hits you, smoky, damp, and thick with the scent of mud and humanity. There's only one small window, and even that's a generous word. It's just a hole stuffed with thin cowhide, letting in a faint brown light. The walls sweat with cold. The floor crunches slightly beneath your boots. The ground isn't really a floor at all, just packed dirt, frozen hard, occasionally spongy when it rains. Welcome to the warmest place you'll ever know. If you're lucky, there's a hearth in the center of the room, a low pit lined with stones, with smoke lazily drifting upward. Don't expect a chimney. Most peasant homes didn't have one. The smoke simply filled the air, wandered around for a bit, and then escaped through the thatch or through your lungs, whichever came first. Your eyes water constantly, your clothes soak up the smell, and by the end of the week, you and the walls are equally smoked. But that's warmth, medieval style, a trade-off between breathing and not freezing. The furniture? Sparse. A rough wooden table, maybe a few stools, some shelves holding pottery, if you owned pottery. Otherwise, everything else was made of what nature offered and poverty allowed. Beds were just straw mats or sacks stuffed with hay laid directly on the ground. The straw flattened quickly, but so did expectations. Every object had a double purpose. The same cloak you wore outside became your blanket at night. The bench by the fire was also where someone slept. Even the walls had duties: hooks to hang drying herbs, strips of meat, and sometimes the family's single lantern, a trembling candle that flickered like it might give up any second. And yet, this cramped, smoky room wasn't just a shelter. It was your entire world. It's where you ate, worked, slept, gave birth, got sick, and if you were really unlucky, died. Families of 5, 6, even 10 people shared the same space, along with chickens, goats, or whatever livestock you didn't trust to survive outside. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort didn't either. Warmth, however, was communal. When the fire burned low, you could feel the temperature drop like a trapdoor opening beneath you. The cold pressed through the walls, through your clothes, straight into your bones. That's when people got creative. They packed the gaps in the walls with moss, shoved rags under the door, and prayed the wind didn't find another crack to whistle through. You can almost imagine the sound, that mournful wail sneaking through the corners, reminding you that the night is long and the firewood short. It's tempting to pity them, sitting in their mud homes, shivering. But in a way, it was a triumph. They had built something that worked. Barely, but it worked. Each patch of daub, each pile of straw, each bit of smoke-stained air was proof of a battle fought and won. Every creak of the wall, every groan of the roof was a reminder that human stubbornness could outlast even the coldest wind. And despite the hardships, there was a strange kind of coziness to it all. After the day's work, hauling water, mending fences, feeding animals, everyone would gather close to the hearth. The flicker of firelight danced over rough faces. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything, and the sound of quiet conversation filled the dark. No one complained that the bed was lumpy or the soup thin. They were together, alive, and for that night, that was enough. Imagine the soundscape. The soft crackle of firewood, the occasional cough, the rhythmic clucking of a chicken settling for the night, and outside, the wind dragging its fingers across the thatch. It's eerie, peaceful, and deeply human. The medieval home wasn't beautiful by our standards. It was small, filthy, and often half-broken. But it was also a masterpiece of endurance. Proof that when faced with impossible conditions, people can make warmth out of almost nothing. So the next time your apartment feels drafty, or your heating bill feels unfair, remember this. Somewhere, 8 centuries ago, a peasant family sat in a one-room hut with a smoky fire, shivering, coughing, and somehow laughing anyway. Because in that flicker of warmth, fragile, fleeting, but real, they weren't just surviving the cold. They were defying it. You've settled into your little house. The fire sputters, the wind moans, and you can already feel the frost pushing at the walls. And that's when you realize something. The walls aren't fighting back. They're losing. But you're a medieval peasant, which means quitting isn't really an option. So you do what any sensible person would do when the wind blows through your home like it owns the place. You patch the holes with mud and straw, and, yes, sometimes with cow dung. Before you cringe, remember, this was genius. Nature provided everything, even its worst-smelling parts, and people used it. The mixture of mud, straw, and dung was more than just affordable insulation. It was survival alchemy. The mud sealed cracks, the straw added structure, and the dung, well, the dung was the secret ingredient. It dried into a surprisingly strong glue that kept the wall from crumbling every time it rained or froze. In the modern world, we'd call it eco-friendly architecture. Back then, it was just whatever keeps us alive tonight. The process was messy and oddly communal. Families and neighbors helped each other smear the mixture across the walls, sometimes with hands, sometimes with wooden paddles, sometimes barefoot if desperation outweighed pride. Children helped too. They were smaller and could reach the lower corners. There was laughter, there was cursing, and yes, there was a smell that made you question your life choices. When it dried, though, it worked. The walls hardened, the drafts slowed, and the inside of your hut became just a little more bearable. Not warm, exactly. That's too generous a word. But less freezing was a victory worth celebrating. On cold nights, you could press your hand to the wall and feel its texture. Rough, uneven, slightly crumbly. The color varied from brown to darker brown, depending on the creative choices of your local livestock. Sometimes bits of straw poked out, forming little whiskers of defiance against the wind. If you leaned close, you could smell the earthy mix of soil and smoke. Unpleasant, yes, but also comfortingly alive. That smell meant safety. It meant you'd done what needed doing. There was a saying among peasants, not one you'll find in any illuminated manuscript, that went something like, "A wall that stinks today won't collapse tomorrow." And that, in its own rustic poetry, summed up the medieval approach to winter. Dignity was optional, practicality was not. The trick wasn't just building walls, it was maintaining them. Each season, cracks reopened, chunks fell out, and the cycle began again. After the first frost, you'd walk the perimeter of your home with a bucket of fresh mud and a handful of straw, inspecting for leaks like a captain checking a ship for holes. Every gap was an invitation for cold, and the cold always RSVP'd. Sometimes people mixed ash or lime into the mud to help it dry faster or resist insects. Others used animal hair or crushed reeds for extra strength. Peasants didn't have architects or engineers, but centuries of trial and error turned them into experts at keeping misery slightly more manageable. And though it looked crude, this building method, wattle and daub, actually lasted. Archaeologists still find traces of medieval walls that survived hundreds of years. Imagine that. Something made of mud and manure outlasting marble monuments. There's a strange kind of poetry in that. The quiet endurance of humble materials long after the grander ones have crumbled. Still, there were moments when the system failed. Heavy rains could wash away parts of the wall. Animals could chew through the straw. In bad winters, the damp crept in so far that frost formed inside the house, glittering faintly by firelight. You'd wake to find your own breath frozen on the inside of the wall, like your home was exhaling with you. But peasants didn't despair. They patched, they piled, they layered, and sometimes they simply shrugged and moved their bed to the driest corner. It wasn't perfect, but it worked just enough to keep the family alive, which was the only standard that mattered. If you're wondering about the smell, yes, it lingered, always. Smoke, sweat, damp straw, and manure blended into a scent that no candle could mask. But here's the strange part. After a while, no one noticed. When everything smells bad, nothing does. The air became familiar, like an old coat. Visitors, on the rare chance anyone visited, might gag at first, but within minutes, their noses surrendered to the atmosphere of survival. Sometimes, people hung herbs or dried flowers near the fire to sweeten the air a little. Lavender, if they had it, mint or thyme, if they didn't. The scent mixed with smoke, creating a rustic version of medieval aromatherapy. Scented with hope and desperation, you might say. And if the walls were the lungs of the house, the smoke was its heartbeat, pulsing slowly, leaving black veins on the ceiling and reminding you that warmth always came at a price. You could scrub the soot, but it would come back. You could open the door to air out the house, but then the cold would follow you inside like an uninvited guest. There was no winning, only balancing. From a distance, the village looked peaceful. Rows of small brown huts huddled together, smoke rising lazily into the gray winter sky. But up close, each house was a story, patched, layered, repaired by 1,000 hands over generations. Mud held memory, straw held sweat, dung held defiance. It's easy to laugh now, in an age of thermostats and insulation foam, but in their own way, those peasants were the world's first environmental engineers, building homes that breathed, absorbed, and adapted to the seasons. Their designs were simple, but they worked, and they kept entire families alive through centuries of brutal winters. So yes, their homes smelled terrible, but so does victory sometimes. And when the night howled outside and the wind beat against the walls, those same rough surfaces, patched with every scrap of courage and cow dung, didn't it just keep the warmth in? They kept hope in too. Let's talk about the floor. You know, that comforting, stable thing under your feet that quietly does its job and asks for nothing in return. In a medieval peasant's home, the floor did not have that attitude. The floor was not your friend. It was an adversary, one you had to sleep on. You see, floors weren't made of wood or stone. That was castle stuff, rich people stuff. A peasant's floor was the ground itself. Compacted dirt, worn smooth by feet, animals, spilled stew, and time. It was part of the earth, and the earth in winter had one personality, frozen. If you stepped barefoot onto it, the shock was instant. The cold didn't politely say hello. It sprinted straight up your legs, settled in your spine, and whispered, "You live here now." Even inside your home, the temperature difference between standing and sitting was dramatic. The higher up you went, say, your shoulders, your head, the warmer it felt. But closer to the floor, that was another climate entirely. Below knee level, it might as well have been the Arctic. So peasants got clever. They knew they couldn't fight the cold head on, but maybe they could negotiate with it. They covered the floor with rushes, long grasses, reeds, straw, or hay to form a kind of natural carpet. If you picture this as something decorative, you're mistaken. It wasn't a cozy rug. It was a crunching, uneven layer of vegetation that flattened, rotted, and collected everything that fell on it. Food scraps, mud, bits of ash, the occasional chicken dropping, all of it blended into what we might politely call floor compost. It sounds disgusting, and it was, but it also worked. The thick mat of organic material trapped a small amount of warmth, absorbed spills, and made walking barefoot slightly less suicidal. Every few weeks, or let's be honest, months, families would scrape up the top layer of rushes and replace them with fresh ones. It was a primitive but effective cleaning system. Imagine peeling up your carpet every few months, tossing it out the door, and laying down a new one made entirely of hay. To add extra warmth, people sometimes sprinkled dried herbs among the rushes, sage, lavender, mint, whatever they could grow or find. It didn't just smell better. It helped keep insects away. For a brief, beautiful week, your floor might even smell faintly like a garden instead of a barn. Of course, the effect didn't last. Within days, the herbs mingled with the smoke and dirt, and the scent of decay reclaimed its throne. But still, for that one evening, you could lie down, close your eyes, and almost pretend life was fragrant. At night, that floor became your bed. Not in theory, literally. Families slept directly on it, or on sacks stuffed with straw laid across it. The straw helped insulate you from the frozen ground, but it also had a bad habit of flattening quickly and housing unwanted guests. Fleas, lice, mites, the full medieval sleepover. If you've ever complained about your mattress being too firm, imagine one that occasionally wriggles. The cold from below never really went away. It found every opening. Through your layers of clothing, through the straw, through the cracks where the wall met the floor, people sometimes joked that the devil himself must be living underneath, breathing icy air up through the earth to torment them. Others said it was punishment for sin, but most peasants just accepted it as part of life, like rain, taxes, or chickens stealing your bread. When the frost was at its worst, some families tried desperate tricks. They would build up a shallow platform using spare planks or stones, anything to get a few inches above the dirt. The difference was small, but it mattered. Cold air sank, and even that little bit of elevation could mean the difference between numb toes and usable ones. A few lucky households used old animal hides as flooring, tanned leather scraps stitched together, or simply laid down as a barrier between flesh and frost. They didn't look nice, they didn't smell nice, but again, warmth first, pride later. During storms, the floor sometimes became less floor, more swamp. Water would seep in through the walls, mixing with the dirt and straw until your living room transformed into a mud puddle. The family would scramble to build small stepping stones out of bricks or logs. Sometimes they'd just wait it out, sitting on stools while the water slowly retreated back to the earth. You might say the medieval home came with a built-in indoor water feature. If you dropped something on the floor, say a spoon, you had a decision to make. Retrieve it and risk frostbite on your fingers, or let it become part of the house forever. Many spoons did not return from these expeditions, and yet, despite the misery, there was something quietly impressive about it all. The peasants learned to live with the earth, not against it. Their homes didn't separate them from nature, they were extensions of it. The floor wasn't a barrier, it was a reminder. You came from the ground, you lived on the ground, and one day you'd return to it. The same dirt that froze your toes in winter would one day cradle your bones in peace. That's the strange poetry of peasant life. Even the floor told a story. Every crack, every footprint, every patch of straw marked 1,000 small acts of endurance. Children learned to walk on that floor. Animals slept on it. Couples argued, prayed, and laughed over it. It wasn't just cold earth. It was memory, pressed flat beneath tired feet. So when the fire died down and the last glow faded from the coals, families curled up together on that unforgiving surface, wrapped in cloaks, pressed close, listening to the wind clawing at the roof. The ground might have been hard, but the arms around you were warm, and that, in the end, was enough, because no matter how cruel the night became, they always woke up on the same patch of earth, battered, sore, coughing maybe, but still alive. And in that world, survival wasn't comfort. It was victory. The floor fought back. But so did they. Every home has a center, a place where life gathers, where warmth seems to collect like light in a jar. For the medieval peasant, that place was the hearth, a shallow pit of stones, a few burning logs, and more hope than fuel. It was not just a fire, it was the single thread keeping the family tethered to life. By day, the hearth was the home's engine, the one spot where warmth, food, and light all happened at once. By night, it became an altar of survival. Imagine the scene, a smoky haze hanging low, every eye fixed on the orange glow, every sound reduced to the rhythm of crackling wood. The air is thick with ash and the faint sweetness of burning peat. It's smoky, yes, but it's warm, and that's enough to make it holy. The hearth didn't just heat the house, it fed it. Stew simmered slowly in a blackened pot, the smell of cabbage and onions clinging to every wall. The soup was thin, but it filled stomachs and spirits alike. People joked that their fire was their best friend, because at least it tried to keep them alive. There was no chimney, of course. Smoke drifted freely, curling around the rafters before slipping out through the thatch. If you stayed inside long enough, you became part of the scenery. Your hair smelling of wood smoke, your skin tinted gray. The eyes stung constantly, watering until you couldn't tell if you were cold or crying. But this was the trade. The fire burned oxygen and gave warmth in return, and everyone accepted the bargain. Sometimes it sputtered, sometimes it flared, and sometimes it simply went out. And when it went out, you didn't just lose heat, you lost your guardian. Keeping the fire alive became a kind of religion. Every family had someone whose job was to tend it, a parent, a grandparent, an older child who knew how to coax embers into flame with just a breath and a prayer. Before going to sleep, they debank the fire, bury the glowing coals under ashes to keep them smoldering through the night. It was a delicate art. Too much ash and you smothered it. Too little and it burned out before dawn. The next morning, when they uncovered the pit and saw even one red coal still breathing, it felt like finding treasure. In that moment, survival wasn't tea measured in wealth or crops. It was measured in the color of the fire. Sometimes, if the fire did die, there was only one solution. Borrow flame from a neighbor. Imagine trudging through snow at dawn, holding a pot lined with straw, praying the wind didn't blow out the small flame you begged from next door. Fire was communal, passed from hand to hand, village to village. To share it was to share life itself. That's why, even now, we speak of keeping the home fires burning. It wasn't just a phrase, it was policy. The hearth was also the family's storyteller. Evenings were spent around it, with children lying on the floor, adults mending tools or weaving baskets, and elders muttering legends of winters past. The fire was hypnotic, the only entertainment for miles. Flames danced, shadows shifted, and imagination filled the rest. You might hear tales of dragons, saints, or the first frost that nearly killed half the village. The stories were always half truth, half prayer, because when the nights were endless, you didn't just need heat, you needed hope. The fire provided both. It was the television, the heater, the clock, and the heart monitor of the home. If it crackled steadily, all was well. If it hissed or dimmed, people fell silent, watching anxiously, as if afraid the house itself might give up. Of course, there were hazards. The hearth was comfort, but it was also danger. A stray spark could turn your roof into kindling. Many homes burned down simply because someone fell asleep too close, or a pet knocked a log out of place. But fear was part of the routine. Like smoke in the air, it was constant, invisible, and endured. To sit by the hearth was to acknowledge both your luck and your fragility. You were alive only as long as the fire allowed you to be. There's a reason ancient languages use the same word for hearth and home. It wasn't metaphorical. The hearth was the home. Without it, the house was just a cold box filled with damp air. When winter raged outside, wind shrieking, frost crawling up the windows, trees snapping under ice, the hearth's little light was the only defiance left in the dark. It didn't conquer the cold, but it pushed back just far enough to remind you that you existed. And that was enough. The fire wasn't just burning wood, it was burning fear. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it now. That quiet crackle, the sigh of heat meeting cold, the sound of survival itself. Families leaned close, faces glowing orange, eyes half closed. The wind might howl, the world might freeze, but inside, a single flame still flickered, stubborn, fragile, alive. The hearth was the heart. And in every village, every winter, that tiny heart beat just long enough to carry the world through another night. When you live one bad night away from freezing, you learn to treat your fire like family. It isn't just warmth, it's continuity, a living thing that needs feeding, protecting, and coaxing back to life every dawn. For medieval peasants, fire wasn't a convenience, it was a sacred duty, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the quiet ritual known as banking the fire. Picture this, the family is ready to sleep. The last scraps of stew have been eaten, the wooden bowls licked clean, the children already cocooned in cloaks near the hearth. The logs have burned down to dull embers glowing softly in the ash. The room smells of smoke, sweat, and boiled cabbage, the perfume of survival. This is the moment that decides tomorrow. Before anyone dares to close their eyes, someone, usually the oldest woman in the house, kneels by the fire. She takes a flat stick, gently stirs the ashes, and tucks the embers together like children under a blanket. Then she scoops cool ash on top, layer by layer, until the orange glow disappears, hidden but alive. The trick is to not smother it completely. You're not putting the fire out. You're lulling it to sleep. If you do it right, by morning there'll still be a faint blush beneath the gray, ready to wake up again. If you do it wrong, you wake up to a frozen house. coughing breath clouds into the dawn, and an empty hearth that mocks you with silence. There are few sounds lonelier than a cold fireplace in winter. When that happened, and it always happened eventually, you didn't just light a match and move on. Matches didn't exist. Flint and tinder took time, skill, and a lot of patience. So most people did what desperate people always do. They borrowed. A child would be sent to the neighbor's house, carrying a clay pot lined with straw or rags, and ask humbly, "Please, can we have a coal?" It sounds simple, but that walk through the snow, carrying a glowing ember in the wind, felt like a pilgrimage. The pot was hugged close, breath held, every step careful. One wrong move, one gust, and the ember died, and so did breakfast. It was an oddly poetic exchange, warmth passing from one home to another, survival shared like bread. Even the poorest villagers gave what they could, because everyone knew someday they'd be the ones knocking. In some places, this nightly ritual became almost ceremonial. Families would whisper a short prayer as they banked the coals. May the fire rest and rise again, superstition mixed with practicality. They believed spirits lived in the hearth, watching over the flames. You never cursed near the fire. You didn't spit into it. You didn't poke it idly with your foot. It wasn't just heat. It was company. When morning came, the same hands would brush aside the ash, searching for the faintest glow. If they found it, a small smile would spread, and the fire would be gently fed with twigs, breath, and patience. When it caught, when smoke turned to flame again, everyone felt it. The day had officially begun. It's strange how something so small could control your mood, your safety, your faith. You didn't start the day when the sun rose. You started it when the fire did. Banking the fire wasn't only about heat. It was about rhythm. The heartbeat of a home beating slowly, night after night. You learned its sounds, the crackle of healthy flame, the sigh of damp wood, the dangerous hiss that meant water somewhere deep inside a log. You read the fire the way modern people read screens. A dancing flame meant luck. A smoky one meant dampness or trouble. If the smoke leaned toward the door, they said the wind would change. If it leaned toward the bed, they said death was coming. Old wives' tales, maybe. But when your life depends on a flame, you start to believe it speaks. Some wealthier cottages, if such a thing could be called wealth, had a built-in stone hearth or an iron grate, but most peasants just had a patch of earth, ringed with stones blackened by years of burning. Those stones were sacred relics, passed down generations. You didn't replace them lightly. Each one carried the memory of winters survived, of soups boiled, of children warmed. They were the silent witnesses of centuries of breath and smoke. It is almost unimaginable now that a single patch of glowing embers could stand between a family and the endless cold. Yet it did, night after night. There's something deeply human about that image. A small fire, carefully buried under ash, glowing unseen in the dark. It's the same instinct that keeps us lighting candles, keeping nightlights on, leaving porch lamps burning long after we've gone to bed. We can't stand total darkness, not because we fear the dark itself, but because we fear what it reminds us of, how fragile warmth really is. The medieval peasant didn't know the science of combustion or airflow, but they understood the art of care. They knew that a little attention, a little faith, could carry a spark through the longest night. And maybe that's what the hearth truly was. Not just a fire pit, but a lesson. That endurance is quiet, that survival glows softly, that warmth, like love, lives longest when tended gently. So tonight, when you blow out your candle or switch off your lamp, imagine that old woman by her fire, hands black with ash, eyes half closed, whispering to the coals as if they could hear her. She smooths the ashes, listens to the soft hiss, and finally leans back, satisfied. The fire sleeps, the house exhales, and outside, winter waits. If you ever think you've overdressed for bed, Let me introduce you to the medieval peasant nightwear collection, otherwise known as everything you own. There were no pajamas, no flannel, no cozy fleece sets with matching socks. You slept in what you worked in, what you ate in, and what you sometimes buried people in. The concept of changing into something comfortable simply didn't exist because nothing was ever comfortable. During winter, warmth was strategy, not luxury. You didn't get ready for bed, you armored up. First came the linen shirt. It wasn't white, not after a few months. It was the color of oatmeal left out in the sun. Coarse, itchy, but breathable. Over that went wool. Always wool. Thick tunics, patched cloaks, maybe a spare shawl if you were lucky. The more layers, the better. Peasants layered so heavily that movement itself became an act of defiance. Turning over in bed could take planning. You didn't so much sleep as marinate. Wool was magic, though. It trapped heat, even when damp. It also trapped everything else. Sweat, smoke, fleas, last week's dinner. But when the wind screamed through your walls at 2 a.m, you didn't care. You smelled terrible, but you survived. Most people slept in their day clothes for one simple reason. They couldn't afford to take them off. Undressing meant exposing your body to the cold, and sometimes your only shirt might be too frozen by morning to put back on. So instead, you went to bed fully dressed. Boots, hat, belt, everything. The medieval version of a weighted blanket. There was a kind of ritual to it. You'd sit by the fire, loosen your belt just enough to breathe, maybe unlace your shoes halfway, and then crawl toward the straw mat with a heavy sigh that said, "Here we go again." Clothing wasn't just for warmth, it was also insurance. If the house caught fire or the roof caved in during the night, both fairly common, you'd already be ready to run. Medieval sleep was many things, but it was never restful. Let's talk about those fabrics for a moment. Wool was the hero, yes, but not all wool was created equal. Fine, soft wool was for lords and priests. Peasants wore the kind that felt like it had opinions about your skin. It itched, constantly. You didn't just wear it, you negotiated with it. Some families tried to soften their wool garments by rubbing them with animal fat or lanolin. This made them slightly less scratchy, but also slightly more flammable. An unfortunate trade-off in a house with an open fire. But, again, warmth first. Fashion, comfort, and safety. Distance second, third, and fourth. In colder regions, people added cloaks or sheepskin wraps, sometimes even sleeping beneath half-cured animal hides. The smell was indescribable. Let's just say your dreams smelled rural. And yes, there were hats, always hats. You did not sleep without one. Medieval wisdom was clear on this. Keep your head warm and the devil won to take you. Whether or not that was true, peasants took no chances. They tied rags or scarves around their heads, tucked their hair in, and sometimes even wore hoods in bed. Because when you woke up, your breath would have frozen your hair into stiff little icicles. Now imagine a family of 6, all bundled in their layers, lying shoulder to shoulder on a straw mat near the hearth. They look less like a family and more like a pile of laundry that gave up. Children clung to parents for warmth. Grandparents nestled close to whoever snored the least. Even the family dog joined the chaos, curling up at someone's feet, a living heater wrapped in fur. No one cared about personal space. There was none. The warmth was collective, the heat of bodies pressed together, breathing in rhythm, surviving together. If someone needed to get up in the night, it was an ordeal. First, you had to extract yourself from the human knot without waking everyone. Then you had to cross the freezing floor, try not to trip over the fire pit, and avoid stepping on the cat. The whole adventure could take 10 minutes, and half your remaining will to live. Clothing was rarely washed in winter. There was no running water, and cold rivers were dangerous. So layers just kept accumulating. Dirt, smoke, sweat, memory. When something got truly unbearable, people aired it by the fire or beat it with sticks outside. If the smell improved, great. If not, they just called it seasoned. And yet, despite the filth and discomfort, there was comfort in routine. Every night, you went through the same motions, wrapping, tucking, adjusting, sighing. The moment you lay down, there was relief. Your body finally stopped shivering. The fire hummed softly. Someone exhaled beside you. You'd fall asleep still dressed, still half cold, but safe in your tiny world of wool and smoke. There's something deeply human about that image. The way people, stripped of everything else, learned to turn scraps into safety. Their clothes weren't elegant, their beds weren't soft, and their rooms weren't warm. But their resourcefulness wrapped them tighter than any blanket could. The medieval peasant's wardrobe was simple. One outfit for life, one for death, and often they were the same. And every night, under the flicker of firelight, they pulled those scratchy, smoke-scented layers close and whispered a quiet thank you. To the fabric, to the warmth, to the fact that they made it through another day. Because in a world made of cold and hunger, every morning you woke up breathing was proof that the layers had done their job. If the walls leaked, the floor froze, and your clothes itched, well, surely the bed was better, right? Not quite. The medieval bed didn't comfort you. It tolerated you. Barely. For peasants, bed was a generous term. It wasn't a frame or mattress. It was a situation. A heap of straw. A sack stuffed with hay. Maybe, if you were feeling fancy, a thin cloth cover to keep the sharp bits from stabbing you in your sleep. The straw was fresh for about 2 nights. Then it flattened, broke, and began its slow transformation into a micro-ecosystem. You didn't just sleep on it, you shared it. Because where there's straw, there are roommates, fleas, lice, mites, the entire medieval pest department. They loved your bed as much as you hated it. Warm, dark, and full of food, it was paradise. That's why sleep tight wasn't just a saying. It was a survival wish. Except, in your case, you didn't even have ropes to tighten. You had straw, and it bit back. The scratching started slow, a tickle on your ankle, a whisper on your neck, then spread like gossip. You'd wake up half dreaming, slap your arm, sigh, and drift back into that half-sleep of resignation. By morning, you'd be covered in tiny bites, but there was no time for self-pity. You brushed yourself off, shook your tunic, and went to work. You didn't complain. Everyone else looked just as blotchy. Sometimes people tried to outsmart the bugs. They added herbs to the straw, lavender, thyme, rosemary, mint, anything to repel the little beasts. It helped for a few nights, maybe. Then the smell faded, and the bugs declared victory. Some boiled their bedding in hot water, though water itself was a luxury. Others roasted straw near the fire before stuffing it in the sack again, hoping to smoke out the pests. But there was no escape. The bed was alive, and it wasn't on your side. If you were lucky enough to have a raised platform, maybe a crude wooden frame, you were slightly better off. The cold air pooled near the floor, so being a foot higher could mean a few degrees warmer. But most peasants slept directly on the ground, sometimes on woven mats, sometimes on nothing but straw and stubbornness. The ground never stopped taking from you. It stole your heat, your comfort, and sometimes your straw too, because animals loved it just as much. The family cat might curl up in the warmest corner. Chickens sometimes roosted near the bed for safety. A mouse might scurry under the straw to hide from the cold, or from the cat. It was less bedroom and more ecosystem of shared suffering. But the worst part wasn't the bugs or the smell. It was the sound. Straw whispered when you moved, rustled, crackled. Every turn of your body was a small thunderstorm in an otherwise silent night. And since entire families often slept side by side, the result was a symphony. Snoring, coughing, babies fussing, someone muttering in their sleep, the fire popping nearby, and the endless chorus of creaking straw. Sleep came not from comfort, but from exhaustion. You didn't drift off. You collapsed. And if the fire burned too low, The cold crept in immediately. It slithered across the floor, over the straw, into the blankets, until everyone began shifting, pulling cloaks tighter, tucking in feet. Someone might get up to poke the coals, muttering under their breath about Saint whoever being lazy again. Still, there was something almost cozy about it if you squint your imagination. The fire flickered softly. Shadows swayed across the walls. Outside, the world was frozen silent. No wind, no animals, just darkness. Inside, a dozen slow breaths rose and fell together, the steady heartbeat of survival. That bed, if you could call it that, was the center of the night. Small miracles. Babies born there. Secrets whispered there. Old hands clasped for the last time. It was scratchy, cold, infested, and real. It was where you ended every day, dirty, tired, half frozen, and woke up to do it all again. In some ways, the straw bed was more honest than any feather mattress could ever be. It didn't lie to you. It didn't pretend to be soft or luxurious. It reminded you, every time you lay down, exactly what you were, a creature of earth, wrapped in cloth, chasing warmth through another endless winter. And yet, despite all that, when the firelight flickered low and your family's breathing filled the room, you could almost call it peaceful. Not comfortable, never that, but peaceful. Because in that fragile stillness, for a few stolen hours, the world outside couldn't touch you. You, the straw, the smoke, the cold, you belonged to each other. And as the lice marched triumphantly across your tunic, you dreamed of summer. If you've ever shared a bed with a snorer, imagine sharing one with your entire village. Because for medieval peasants, winter sleeping wasn't a solo activity. It was a group project in warmth, noise, and awkward intimacy. Forget privacy. The medieval concept of personal space was about as thin as their walls. When the temperature dropped, families, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes neighbors, all squeezed into the same sleeping space. The rule was simple. The more bodies, the more heat. And if that sounds unpleasant, well, it was. But it was also the difference between waking up tired and waking up dead. Imagine it. One small hut, a single smoky fire pit, straw beds scattered around like forgotten laundry, the air thick with smoke, livestock, and the vague aroma of damp wool. Outside, the wind howls through the cracks, rattling the thatch. Inside, everyone huddles close enough to breathe the same air twice. Children get tucked between adults, the warmest spot. The elders are pressed near the center, guarded on both sides. The stronger adults take the edges, acting as human insulation. It's a practical arrangement, a slow, snoring organism designed to survive the night. You didn't need central heating when you had Cousin Jeffrey's armpit. On especially brutal nights, families went even further, bringing in their animals. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, even the family dog all shared the same living space. It wasn't weird, it was genius. A single cow radiates more heat than you might think, a walking, mooing radiator. Goats gave off warmth too, and pigs? Pigs were practically furnaces. The smell was appalling, yes, but the comfort was undeniable. One 14th century account even praised the practice. Better to sleep with a warm beast than a cold conscience. Which sounds noble until you realize they meant it literally. The bed-sharing arrangement had its own etiquette. You didn't thrash around or kick. That was a fast way to make enemies. You didn't hog the covers, what little there were. And if you happened to be on the outer edge, congratulations. You were tonight's designated human shield against the cold. Those on the outside woke up first, their backs stiff and half frozen. Those in the middle woke up last, sweaty and half suffocated. Everyone else just woke up sore. And yet, this chaotic pile of humanity worked. Body heat pooled between them, trapped beneath wool cloaks, straw mats, and stubborn willpower. They became their own ecosystem, steaming, stinking, but alive. There were no separate bedrooms, no partitions, no locked doors. The fire burned at the center, flickering faintly through the smoky air, while the family around it breathed in a strange rhythm, one body inhaling as another exhaled. The sound was hypnotic, a chorus of life, layered with snores, grumbles, and the occasional goat sneezing. Some found comfort in that noise. Silence was more dangerous. Silence meant the fire was dying. Silence meant someone had stopped breathing. So the night was alive, with whispers, shuffles, snorts, and sighs. It wasn't all misery, though. There was tenderness, too. Parents would hum softly to restless children. Old couples would murmur prayers before sleep. Someone might tell a story, quietly, between coughs, about saints, monsters, or summers long gone. For a few minutes, the cold outside didn't matter. The stories and warmth blurred together until the night became almost gentle. And when morning came, the first to stir, usually whoever slept closest to the fire, would stretch, groan, and poke at the embers. Smoke rose, light seeped through the cracks, and the family began to separate like dough being pulled apart. One by one, they sat up, rubbed their eyes, and looked around with the quiet satisfaction of people who had once again beaten the cold. It's funny, modern life chases solitude, privacy, quiet. But back then, survival meant togetherness. You didn't choose who you slept next to. You didn't complain about the snoring, or the smell, or the goat trying to steal your blanket. Because the truth was simple. Warmth was love. Not romantic love, but the kind that says, we're all still here. Each night was a test, and every morning was a small miracle. A chorus of sniffles, sneezes, and sleepy yawns. Proof that the system worked. You might not have had your own bed, but you had something better, a heartbeat in the dark beside yours, reminding you that even in the coldest times, humans survived the same way we always have, by clinging to one another. If you think having pets on the bed is a modern indulgence, let me assure you, medieval peasants did it first, just not out of affection. When the nights turned cruel and frost turned breath to fog, there was one undeniable truth about surviving winter. The animals stayed inside. The medieval peasant's home wasn't divided into tidy rooms. There was no kitchen, no living room, no bedroom. It was all one smoky, noisy, ever-shifting space. And part of that space belonged to the livestock. A cow, a pig, a few chickens, maybe a goat or two, all sharing your floor, your warmth, and sometimes your dinner. You didn't invite them in because you wanted company. You did it because they radiated heat. And in a world without insulation, that was priceless. Imagine it, the wind screaming through the cracks, snow piling up outside, your fire dying low. You huddle in the corner with your family, shivering. The door creaks open, and in walks the cow. Her hooves thud softly against the packed dirt floor, her breath steaming like a small engine. She finds her spot near the wall, sighs deeply, and settles down. A moment later, you feel it. A shift in the air, a faint warmth that spreads across the room like mercy. Then come the goats, clumsy and curious, nibbling at everything that isn't nailed down. The pig trots in last, grunting in protest, already judging your housekeeping. Within minutes, the entire household, human and otherwise, has rearranged itself into one big, living furnace. It's loud, it's smelly, it's heaven. Animals made the difference between a cold night and a deadly one. Each creature produced heat, moisture, and carbon dioxide, all of which helped raise the temperature inside the house, even if it meant the air got thick enough to chew. People even planned for this. In many villages, homes were built attached to barns, with just a wall, sometimes not even that, separating the family from their livestock. The warmth from the animals' bodies drifted through the gaps, turning the entire structure into a crude, medieval version of central heating. Was it glamorous? Absolutely not. But it worked. Of course, This setup came with consequences. The smell was legendary. A mix of smoke, sweat, manure, and wet hay. The floor was constantly damp, the air thick with flies in warmer months, and every surface covered in a faint layer of dust and fur. If you've ever burned a scented candle and thought, "That's earthy," trust me, you don't know the half of it. Still, peasants adapted. They swept the dirt floor daily, threw down fresh straw, and tried to keep the animals somewhat contained. Chickens were the worst offenders, unpredictable, loud, and prone to laying eggs in the most inconvenient places. The pig, on the other hand, was a quiet, stoic roommate, often treated almost like a member of the family. You could talk to your pig, complain to your cow, and nobody would think you strange. After all, they were the only ones who listened without interrupting. But the animals brought more than heat. They brought rhythm, the sound of life continuing even in the darkest months. The soft cluck of a hen in the early hours, the slow chewing of a cow, the pig's occasional grunt as it dreamed of spring. Those sounds were comforting, proof that the world was still moving, because when the snow covered everything and the days blurred into gray silence, a single living sound, a bleat, a snore, a rustle, could remind you that life persisted inside these fragile walls. In that sense, the animals weren't just livestock, they were guardians. Their breath filled the room with invisible warmth. Their presence pushed back the loneliness of the endless winter. Sometimes, though, they crossed the line. The goat might chew your sleeve while you slept. The chickens might decide your bed straw made an excellent nesting spot. And in the morning, you might step into something unspeakable. But nobody shouted, nobody kicked them out, because everyone knew the animals were guests of necessity. You could clean the floor later. You couldn't rebuild a family lost to frost. When spring finally arrived and the animals moved back outside, the house felt strangely empty. The air was cleaner, yes, but quieter. The nights, cooler. For all their smell and chaos, the beasts had become part of the family's heartbeat. You could measure winter's end not by the flowers outside, but by the silence inside. Today, people light candles, buy wool blankets, and run electric heaters for comfort. 800 years ago, comfort walked in on 4 legs, smelled like hay, and sometimes chewed your table. And somehow, that made life bearable. The cold could take everything: crops, health, hope. But as long as a cow's warm breath still rose in the corner, you weren't truly alone. Because in the end, the medieval peasant's home wasn't built of stone or wood. It was built of bodies, human and animal, pressed together in defiance of the cold. Morning in a medieval winter didn't start with birdsong. It started with dread. That small moment when you realized your eyelids had frost on them. Again, the fire had burned low during the night, the embers now dull beneath the ash. The air was motionless, heavy, and bitterly cold. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting, but claims you. Your breath hung in front of your face like little ghosts, and when you tried to move, every joint protested. No alarm clock, no sunrise through the curtains, just the faint gray light slipping through a piece of oiled hide in the wall. And a rooster outside who, for some reason, thought this frozen world was worth crowing about. You didn't stretch or yawn, you braced. The first challenge was simple: getting up. It sounds easy, but when your bed was a pile of half-frozen straw and your body was wrapped in every scrap of wool you owned, standing up felt like volunteering for punishment. You didn't leap out of bed in the morning. You negotiated your exit. First, you listened. Was the fire still breathing? Could you hear the faint hiss of an ember under the ashes? If yes, a small miracle. If no, well, good luck. Then came the process. Uncurl one arm from the warmth, reach toward the hearth, feel the cold bite your skin, and immediately regret being alive. Someone had to do it. Someone always did. Crawl across the icy floor, blow on the ashes, pray to St. Bridget, or whoever was on duty that day, and coax the fire back to life. If it caught, the entire room breathed again. If it didn't, You could almost hear the collective groan of despair. Even after the fire returned, the morning chill clung to everything, to your clothes, to your hair, to the damp walls that glittered faintly with frost. If you left your shoes by the door, they'd be frozen stiff, bent into the exact shape of regret. Sometimes the water bucket turned to solid ice, so you had to break it before washing your face, a process that was less refreshing and more emotional damage. People didn't so much wash up as wake up enough to function. A quick splash, a muttered curse, maybe a prayer to endure another day. Breakfast wasn't a feast either. There were no hot pastries or coffee to look forward to, just a cold chunk of yesterday's bread, maybe softened in weak ale or warm water. If you were lucky, there might be a spoonful of porridge left from the night before, scraped from the sides of the pot. If not, you'd make do with what you had, which was usually hunger. But that first meal didn't need to be fancy. It only needed to remind you that you'd made it to morning, and that was victory enough. As the fire revived, the light grew stronger. The hut came back to life. The animals stirred, snorting, bleating, clucking. Someone coughed. A child sneezed. The smell of smoke thickened, mixing with damp wool and boiled grain. You'd hear the creak of wood as someone opened the door, letting in a blast of air so sharp it made everyone gasp. The world outside was white, still, and mercilessly beautiful. Frost covered everything, trees, fences, even the thatched roofs glistening like sugar. And yet, stepping outside was non-negotiable. There was work to do. That's the part modern minds forget. Winter wasn't a break, it was maintenance. You had to check the animals, haul water, chop wood, sweep the ashes, and pray your roof didn't cave under snow. Every small task was survival in slow motion. So, wrapped in stiff layers of wool, you stepped into the cold, your boots crunching through the snow, breath blooming like smoke, the silence of the countryside broken only by the faint rhythm of axes and distant bells. The cold didn't ask permission, it simply was, and you learned to live beside it, like a neighbor you couldn't evict. But here's the strange part. There was beauty too, the way the morning light hit the frost, turning the world silver, the way your breath sparkled in the air as if you were made of light, the soft sound of snow falling from the thatch, the first spark catching in the hearth, the quiet murmurs of a family coming back to life. It wasn't comfort, it was endurance, and endurance in its own way was sacred. Because when you've survived night after night of that kind of cold, morning isn't just routine, it's rebirth. Each dawn felt like proof that you'd won another round in a never-ending fight. So you stood there, smoke rising behind you, the world frozen before you. And you didn't smile exactly, but you breathed, and that was enough. The sun, when it finally showed itself, was more decorative than useful, a pale coin hanging low in the sky, too weak to warm, too distant to care. But for medieval peasants, the work didn't stop just because the world froze. If anything, it got harder, because every task, every breath, every step happened through the weight of cold and hunger. Winter wasn't a time of rest. It was a slow-motion emergency that lasted for months. The harvest was over. The fields were bare, the soil locked beneath frost. There were no crops to tend, no weeds to pull, no green anywhere. But that didn't mean you got to stay inside and hibernate. You still had animals to feed, water to haul, tools to repair, fences to fix, wood to chop, and fires to keep burning. If you didn't, you wouldn't make it to spring. The first job of the morning was wood. Always wood. The fire ate through it faster than you could collect it, and if you ever ran out, well, you'd better start saying your goodbyes. So you grabbed your axe, trudged through the snow, and searched for anything that would burn. Sometimes it was fallen branches, sometimes bits of broken fence, sometimes the handle of a tool. You didn't need that much. Wood was worth more than gold. You didn't waste it, didn't burn it carelessly, didn't ever fall asleep without banking it properly. Because if the fire died in the night, so might you. Then came the animals. They were as cold and miserable as you were, maybe more. Their breath puffed white in the air, their hooves slick with frozen mud. You hauled water from the well, cracking the ice first, and scattered what feed you had left. There was no such thing as abundance in winter. The haystack that once seemed endless was shrinking, and every handful you gave the animals was measured with the precision of a miser counting coins. If a cow got sick, it was a disaster. If a chicken stopped laying, that was one less meal. So you watched them closely, whispered prayers as you worked, and hoped they'd forgive you for keeping them inside your smoky house at night. Then there was food for you. Meals became smaller, stranger, and more creative as winter dragged on. The fresh vegetables were long gone, the milk was thin, and meat, if you had any, was salted so heavily it could double as currency. Bread grew harder each week, dense and dark, made with whatever flour or grain you could stretch. Sometimes that meant barley, oats, or even crushed acorns. It filled your stomach, but barely. Soup was the universal answer. A few turnips, maybe a carrot, a bit of dried meat or bone boiled again and again until it gave up the last of its flavor. Every pot told a story of thrift and survival. You didn't eat for pleasure. You ate to stop the shaking. By February, hunger turned quiet and patient, not the dramatic kind that growls, the kind that lingers, dull and constant. You learned to ignore it. Children asked less often for food. They already knew the answer. Adults spoke less, moved slower, and rationed everything, even their own energy. When someone offered you a scrap of cheese or a heel of bread, you didn't say thank you. You just nodded. Because gratitude took effort too. Yet, even in this bleak rhythm, there was a strange sort of peace. The world was still. The land rested. So did you, in your own way. The work was steady, repetitive, grounding. Mend the fence, feed the animals, chop the wood, stir the pot. The same motions every day. Small rituals that kept you tethered to the idea of spring. And when the wind howled outside, rattling the roof and whistling through the cracks, you didn't curse it. You just listened. Because in its own cold language, the wind was telling you a truth you already knew. That life, no matter how frozen, keeps moving. Sometimes you'd step outside at dusk, after a long day of trudging through slush and smoke, and the world would fall silent. Snow muffled every sound. The fields stretched white to the horizon, glowing faintly under a gray sky. It was lonely, but also breathtaking. You'd see the faint trail of your own footprints, the curl of smoke from the roof, and think, we're still here. The cold hadn't beaten you yet. The hunger hadn't won. The darkness hadn't swallowed you whole. And that, in medieval terms, was triumph. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a personality test. It revealed who could endure, who could adapt, who could keep going when there was nothing left to give. And somehow, every year, they did. Because peasants didn't dream of luxury or warmth. They dreamed of enough. Enough wood, enough food, enough fire, enough light to make it through one more day. And when you live like that, when your life becomes a chain of small victories, even the cold begins to feel like an old companion. Unforgiving, yes, but honest. If summer was for living, winter was for chewing thoughtfully and pretending it was food. Medieval peasants didn't eat to be satisfied. They ate to postpone despair. Because by January or February, the pantry looked less like a storehouse and more like a museum of regret. Let's set the scene. You open your food chest, a wooden box, maybe sealed with wax or clay to keep out rats. Inside, there's a small collection of what's left from autumn. Some turnips, now wrinkled and soft. A few onions, sprouting little green tails. A bag of dried peas. Maybe a single strip of salted pork that has been hanging over the fire for 3 months and now resembles a religious relic. That's dinner for the week. The winter diet was a masterclass in low expectations. Vegetables that survived were either roots or miracles. Cabbage, leeks, carrots, and turnips were hearty enough to last. But after weeks of boiling, they all started to taste like warm resignation. Most of what people ate came from storage, salted, dried, smoked, or pickled months before. Meat was rare and rationed. Salt was precious too, so much that you could measure a family's fortune by how white their salt pile was. And then there was bread, the foundation of life and the destroyer of teeth. Bread was everything: meal, plate, utensil, and symbol. But not all bread was created equal. The nobility ate white loaves made from fine wheat flour. Peasants, they ate what could be called interpretive bread, a dense dark block made from barley, rye, or oats. Whatever hadn't been eaten by rats or taxes. Some even mixed in ground beans, chestnuts, or sawdust like chaff from the mill just to stretch the dough. The result was heavy, filling, and mildly offensive. It didn't rise much, but then again, neither did anyone's spirits in February. Still, that bread was sacred. It was the difference between life and starvation. People crossed themselves before eating it, partly from faith, partly from gratitude, partly from indigestion. Then came the soups and stews, the medieval answer to everything. If you had a pot, some water, and one questionable vegetable, you had dinner. The same pot often simmered for days, with new ingredients added each night. A little grain, a bit of onion, a piece of fat, or, on rare occasions, a sliver of meat. This wasn't cooking. This was archaeology in real time. The flavor deepened, the color darkened, and by the end of the week, the stew could practically stand up on its own. They called it pottage, a name that sounds fancy, but really just meant whatever's left. And it fed the entire household over and over again until everyone started having dreams about turnips. Protein came mostly from dairy, milk, cheese, butter, though in winter even that dwindled. Cows produced less milk in the cold, and any cheese that wasn't eaten early was stored in salt or smoked into stone-like wheels that needed to be soaked, grated, or begged for forgiveness before eating. Fish was a luxury inland, but for those near rivers or the sea, it was a saving grace, dried, salted, or smoked, and eaten on Fridays, as God demanded. You could tell how far someone lived from the coast by how long they had to chew their fish. Eggs were rare, since hens laid less in the dark months. Honey was scarce. Sugar, a myth. Fruit, only dried apples, prunes, or whatever you'd hung in the rafters and prayed wouldn't mold. Sometimes, hunger pushed people into creative, or desperate, territory. They foraged for bark, nettles, or dried herbs. They boiled bones again and again until even the memory of flavor was gone. There are records of people grinding old bread into meal and baking it again, the culinary equivalent of recycling despair. And yet, even in scarcity, there were small joys. A bit of ale shared among neighbors, a spoonful of honey saved for a sick child, the first onion sprout breaking through the dirt in late winter, a whisper from spring that life wasn't finished yet. Meals were social glue. Even the poorest shared what they could. You didn't eat alone, not just because it was lonely, but because it was dangerous. Hunger made everyone vulnerable, and sharing food, even meager food, kept peace alive. Around the fire, families ate from the same bowl, passing spoons or just scooping with bread. The talk was quiet, sometimes cheerful, sometimes not. Children fell asleep mid-bite. Adults chewed slowly, thinking of warmer days, and said little. Because when your life depends on what didn't rot, words feel extravagant. The miracle wasn't the food itself, but the attitude behind it. They ate the same stew for a week and still thanked heaven for it. They endured bread that broke knives and still called it a blessing. It wasn't optimism. It was respect for the land, the labor, and the fragile thread of survival that held everything together. And when you live like that, even the simplest meal, a crust of bread dipped in broth, feels like grace, Every peasant's nightmare began the same way, with silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind of silence that tells you something vital is missing. You wake in the middle of the night, half dreaming, your breath visible in the dark. No glow from the hearth, no soft hiss of embers, just a gray pit where life used to be. The fire is dead. At first, you lie still, hoping you're wrong. Maybe there's one coal left, hidden under the ash. Maybe, if you blow just right, it'll come back. You crawl forward, fingers trembling, brush the cold ashes aside. Nothing. The realization hits like ice water. The fire is gone. You don't curse. You don't cry. You just sit there in the dark, listening to the house breathe. Wood creaking, wind whispering through the cracks, the sound of frost sneaking in. And you know what that means. By morning, the water bucket will be frozen solid. Your clothes will be stiff as bark. The animals will suffer. And unless someone acts fast, so will you. Rebuilding a fire from scratch was no easy task. There were no matches, no lighter fluid, no guaranteed success. All you had was flint, steel, and faith. You gathered what little tinder you had left, dried moss, scraps of straw, maybe a bit of cloth, and struck the flint again and again, hoping for a spark that would catch. Your hands were numb, the air biting at your skin. Each failed attempt stole another layer of patience. When a tiny spark finally leapt to life, you cradled it like a newborn, shielding it from the wind, feeding it gently until it grew, whispering encouragement as if it could hear you. And when that spark finally became flame again, even a small, weak one, you felt a rush of relief so deep it bordered on spiritual, because you weren't just lighting wood, you were relighting existence. But sometimes the spark didn't come. The flint was damp, the straw too wet, the wind too cruel, and then there was only one option left. Borrow fire. The trek to a neighbor's hut in the dead of winter was a ritual of desperation. You'd wrap yourself in whatever cloth you had, brace against the wind, and trudge through snow that swallowed your ankles. The moon hung like a frozen coin, the stars sharp and cruel. By the time you reached their door, your fingers ached, your breath cut your throat, and you'd start to wonder whether a single coal was really worth this. Then the door opened, and you were reminded, yes, it was. There was no judgment in those moments. Everyone understood. Tomorrow, it might be you lending the ember. Your neighbor would dig through their hearth, find a glowing coal, nestle it in straw, and hand it over like treasure. You'd cup it carefully, shielding it from the wind as you hurried home. That tiny glow was hope incarnate, fragile, flickering, sacred, a single orange heartbeat against the endless black. When you made it back home and fed that coal to your dead fire, you'd whisper a thank you to your neighbor, to the saints, to anyone listening. And as the warmth returned, crawling slowly across the room, so did something else. Courage. Because when the fire died, it wasn't just cold that filled the house. It was despair, that creeping, heavy kind that whispered questions in the dark. How long will we last? How much wood is left? How many more nights like this? The medieval winter was not just a season. It was a test of faith, in the fire, in the land, in yourself. Every flame was temporary. Every night, a negotiation with death. And yet, each time the fire returned, so did humanity itself. The glow wasn't just heat, it was identity. It turned a pile of mud and straw into a home. It turned exhaustion into laughter, fear into sleep, and darkness into something you could bear. Even the poorest peasants treated the hearth like an altar. Some placed small charms or crosses nearby. Others whispered blessings before blowing on the coals. Fire was not a tool, it was a companion, a spirit, a silent witness to survival. And when it died, a piece of you did too. But when it came back, you could almost believe that warmth had a soul, and it had chosen to stay. So tonight, if you ever find yourself staring into a candle flame or watching the glow of a fireplace, remember, for thousands of winters, that light was the only thing standing between humanity and oblivion. and for one cold peasant on one long night it was enough. The cold was cruel, but the darkness was worse. Because in the Middle Ages, night didn't last 8 hours. It lasted half your life. As winter deepened, daylight shrank to a thin silver ribbon. 6, maybe 7 hours of pale sun that seemed embarrassed to show its face. Then came the long stretch of black, 16 hours of silence, cold and flickering firelight. There were no lamps to push it back, no streetlights, no glowing windows across the hill. When night fell, it fell completely. The world turned to shadow, and the only sound was wind and your own heartbeat. For medieval peasants, the long darkness wasn't just a backdrop. It was a character, something alive, watching, whispering. The fire's glow only reached so far. Beyond it, the edges of the room disappeared. The corners grew vague, uncertain. You knew your family was near, the shape of your wife, the faint snore of your child, but the world beyond the hearth was unknowable. Sometimes you'd swear you saw movement, just a flicker, a shape where none should be, but you didn't look too closely, because in that world, when you stared into darkness, you weren't sure it wouldn't stare back. Night changed people. It slowed their thoughts, warped their fears, turned every creak into a ghost, and every gust of wind into an omen. They called it the wolf's hour, those coldest moments before dawn, when even the fire seemed to hesitate, and the line between dreaming and waking blurred. Superstition grew thicker than smoke. Candles were too precious to waste, so you sat in near blackness, the hearth your only sun. Shadows danced against the wall, stretching, twisting, merging into shapes that looked human until they didn't. It was then that people prayed most fervently. Not for wealth, not for health, but for light. Not metaphorical light, actual, physical, flame on a stick light. Darkness was a kind of hunger, not for food, but for proof. Proof that you still existed. When the fire burned low, you'd feel it. That creeping isolation that made even the air feel heavier. The nights were so long that time itself seemed to dissolve. You'd wake, think morning must be close, then realize it wasn't even midnight. Children whimpered in their sleep, dogs growled softly at nothing, and you lay awake, eyes open, counting the cracks in the ceiling, waiting for the faintest shift in light. Winter's darkness didn't just steal sight, it stole rhythm. Work stopped earlier, meals grew quieter, people spoke less. Conversation turned inward, to dreams, to fears, to whispers about spirits and demons that prowled between dusk and dawn. The church warned that the devil was strongest at night. The old folk warned that the forest listened. No one left the house after sundown unless they had no choice. You locked the door, not to keep others out, but to keep the dark from coming in. Yet even in that endless black, there were rituals of comfort. Someone would stir the fire, poke the coals, and for a moment, faces reappeared, red and gold and alive again. A child would lean against a parent's shoulder. Someone would hum an old tune, something without words, half lullaby, half prayer. It didn't chase away the night, but it reminded you that you weren't alone inside it. Sleep came in stages. People didn't sleep straight through. They dozed, woke, prayed, and dozed again. 2 sleeps, broken by a few hours of quiet wakefulness in between. Historians call it the first sleep and the second sleep. But for peasants, it was simply how time worked when clocks didn't exist and the dark lasted too long to ignore. Between sleeps, you might mend something by firelight, whisper to your spouse, feed a baby, or just sit still and listen to the wind outside. It was the night's brief intermission, a pause between 2 rounds of endurance. Then eventually, you drift off again, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. The night tested faith as much as the body. Priests said darkness was the devil's cloak. Midwives said it was when the dead walked. Old farmers said it was when the earth itself was breathing, resting before spring. Each explanation was a way to survive the unknown. because the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Darkness didn't mean anything, it just was. And for humans, nothing is the hardest thing to face. Sometimes the dark was gentle, quiet, calm, thick with sleep, but other times it turned hostile. The roof creaked, the wind shrieked, a tree groaned outside like something alive. You'd clutch your blanket tighter, whisper a name you hoped could protect you, and wait for the sound to pass. You'd wonder if the darkness outside was the same as the one inside. The cold part of your own mind that whispered, what if the light doesn't come back? But it always did. At dawn, the first hint of gray would appear through the tiny window. Faint, pale, and miraculous. Someone would stir, someone else would sigh in relief. And when the fire finally caught again and the walls glowed orange, you'd realize you'd survived another night, not just in body, but in spirit. The long darkness had passed, for now. And in that moment, with your family yawning beside you and the frost melting on the roof, you could almost believe that light was a kind of mercy, because it didn't matter how many nights the world froze or how long the shadows stretched. As long as there was one spark, one flame, one sunrise, the darkness never truly won. When the nights grew endless and the wind scraped against the roof like a warning, people didn't turn to reason, they turned to faith. Not the polished kind of faith carved into cathedral stone, but the rough, smoky kind that lived in peasant huts. Half prayer, half superstition, and entirely survival. In the medieval winter, faith wasn't about philosophy. It was about heat. You prayed not for enlightenment, but for firewood, not for forgiveness, but for a mild wind. The divine felt closer when your breath froze in the air, because only something bigger than you could possibly be in charge of weather this cruel. Religion was everywhere in the peasant's year, but winter made it personal. The saints weren't distant figures in illuminated books. They were neighbors you begged for favors. Saint Bridget for the hearth, Saint Blaise for the throat, Saint Anthony for the animals, Saint Nicholas for the children, Saint Lawrence for when you needed to laugh about being roasted alive. Each family had a small wooden cross or icon hanging by the fire. The smoke had long since blackened it, and the saints' faces were faded, but the gesture mattered. Before sleeping, someone would whisper, "Keep the fire alive." Not metaphorically, literally. They believed sin could make a fire go cold, that demons could blow out coals, that a hearth without prayer was a door left open to darkness. When times were desperate, villagers walked miles to the church, even through snow, up to their knees. The building was freezing, the air filled with incense and breath. Candles flickered weakly, their light doing more for courage than warmth. They knelt anyway, bones creaking, fingers stiff, and thanked God for everything that hadn't yet been taken. Faith was not luxury, it was insulation. But saints weren't the only ones credited for survival. Old beliefs still lingered, older than the church, whispered when priests weren't listening. Some said the frost was the breath of spirits wandering the fields. Others left offerings, a crust of bread, a splash of ale, for the winter folk, unseen guardians of the land who might bless your home with mercy or leave it buried in snow. The church called it superstition. The peasants called it hedging your bets, because when you're shivering in a mud hut at midnight, you pray to anyone who might be listening. The cold blurred the line between faith and fear. If an animal died, it was a test from God. If the roof collapsed, maybe the devil had walked by. If a fire refused to light, someone in the family must have sinned. It sounds naive now, but that logic was the only thing holding chaos at bay. If there was a reason, then there was still order. And if there was order, then maybe, just maybe, spring would come again. The villagers marked holy days obsessively through winter, small sparks of purpose in an otherwise shapeless season. St. Nicholas's feast in December brought laughter and meager treats for children, dried fruit, nuts, or just the promise of a story by the fire. Candlemas in February was a quiet celebration of light returning. People carried candles through the village, blessing them for the year ahead, their soft flames trembling in the cold air. Each ritual was a reminder. The sun would come back. The darkness would end. It had to. In the deepest part of winter, even priests struggled to find words. Sermons became less about sin and more about endurance. "Be patient," they said. "The Lord's work is slow, like spring beneath snow." People nodded. They didn't need grand theology. They just needed hope in a language they could feel. The crackle of fire, the smell of smoke, the faint warmth returning to their hands. And when tragedy came, when a child grew sick, or a neighbor didn't wake, or an animal froze in the night, they didn't shout at heaven. They whispered, "God willing, the rest will see spring." Faith wasn't about expecting miracles. It was about surviving without them. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the old woman of the house would rise first, brush the frost from the window, and look out toward the pale horizon. Her breath fogged the glass as she muttered a line she'd said 1,000 times. "Cold keeps the soul awake." Then she'd smile faintly, kneel by the fire, and coax it back to life. The smoke rose slowly, curling toward the dark ceiling like a prayer that didn't need words. And somewhere between heaven and earth, between faith and frost, the world began again. Cold takes first what you need most: your fingers, your toes, the small brave parts of you that do the work of living. Medieval peasants knew the signs before doctors had names for them. The sting that becomes a numbness, the red that fades to white, the skin that feels like wood, then like nothing at all. They didn't say frostbite. They said, "The cold has eaten him," or "Her fingers are going to sleep and won't wake." Sleep was always the danger in winter. For fires, for bodies, for the will. Hands went first. You used them for everything: chopping, hauling, milking, mending. They were the first to plunge into icy water, the last to leave the bitter wind, and the tools you could never spare. To lose feeling in your hands was to lose your grip on the whole day, so people wrapped and rewrapped. Rags, old wool, leather scraps, anything. Some rubbed animal fat into skins and gloves to block the wind. Others tucked hot stones into cloth and pressed them into palms, trading smoke for sensation. You didn't chase comfort, you chased circulation. Feet were quieter victims. They suffered in silence, hidden in clogs stuffed with straw, wrapped in layers of linen and hope. If the ground outside was a frozen sheet, the ground inside was only slightly less ambitious. Every step siphoned heat away. Peasants learned small tricks. They lined shoes with dried moss or wool combings. They set boots near the coals at dusk, but never too close. Leather cracked like old bark when scorched. They changed straw often, knowing that dampness was winter's oldest accomplice. When toes went numb, you didn't boast about endurance. You stamped your feet, you swore at the floor, you admitted you were afraid. Because everyone knew someone whose toes never quite forgave February. Faces told the season, cheeks wine-burned into permanent maps, noses red and raw, lips split thin as parchment. Children licked frost from doorframes and learned the price quickly. Mothers wrapped scarves high, breathed through wool, and scolded, nose breathing, not mouth breathing. The air's too sharp. It wasn't superstition, it was technique. Shallow breaths through cloth warmed the air just enough. A hood pulled forward created a small private climate, barely above freezing, but yours. Sleep happened under fabric canopies of breath, damp and ugly and absolutely necessary. Illness didn't need an invitation. Winter flung the door wide open. Coughs settled into chests and stayed there. Throats rasped from smoke and cold together. Each breath a negotiation. People drank hot onion broth, chewed honey, if there was any, and asked Semblé to mind the pipes. Fevers frightened more than frost. You could see cold creeping onto skin, but fever flickered from within. bright and uncatchable. The hut became a ward, someone boiling water, someone praying, someone telling the patient stories until the stories ran out. The fire worked double shifts, its glow passing for medicine because sometimes there was nothing else. The cruelest thing about frostbite was its false promises. Numbness felt like relief, pain returned like debt, hands thawed too fast, would stab with needles of heat, the kind that made even quiet men curse through their teeth. Old wisdom said warm slowly, near the fire, not in it, with wool, not flame. Rub with snow, some whispered, others swore never to do it. Animal fat, warmed cloth, breath cupped like a blessing. These were the remedies that didn't require luck. When damage stayed, it stayed publicly. Blackened tips, pale scars that never colored in spring, feet that limped when the thaw came because winter's hand had already written its name behind the skin. Nobody pointed, nobody asked. Everyone could read the story. Then there was the heart, not the organ, the morale, the part that gets frostbitten in silence. Days without sun stretched long as rope, chores multiplied while food divided. Laughter became a winter bird, rare, small, startling when it landed. People guarded each other's sparks. A joke offered like bread. A song hummed under breath while stirring the pot. A promise spoken out loud. Spring is already walking. She's just slow. They didn't say depression. They said he's under the weather, which was not so much a metaphor as a location. To help, you moved together, split wood in pairs, patched walls in a cluster, cooked at the same fire. Loneliness was the draft no one could plug alone. Herbs hung blackened over rafters did their quiet work. Thyme for coughs, yarrow for wounds, juniper smoke for air that felt heavy with sickness and story. A midwife or wise woman might visit, fingers warm from holding a heated stone, eyes sharp as flint. She knew which teas eased breathing and which whispers eased fear. She carried prayers and poultices in the same bag and used both with equal certainty. Men respected her because winters had taught them to. Pride froze quicker than water. Help, when offered, was heat. Refusing it was a luxury nobody could afford. Sometimes winter took pieces and left the person. A finger gone to black, an ear that would never feel the wind again. A shepherd counting with new math come lambing time. They did not hide these losses. They folded them into the year. That was the winter of the river ice, or the year the north wind took Tom's toe. Memories stored by weather, not dates. A calendar written in scars. Grief had manners then. It stayed quiet, worked its share, sat by the fire without asking for more fuel than the rest. On feast days, it drank a little, sang low, and let itself be held for a while. Then it went back to work with everyone else. Yet winter also taught tenderness with an ungloved hand. How to wrap a child's hands in your cloak while you walked. How to give the middle of the bed to the eldest without being asked. How to lift someone's cup to their lips when their fingers forgot how to hold. These were not heroic deeds. They were the grammar of survival. You learned to conjugate care in every tense. I warm, you warm, we warm. And in that language, people became fluent. When spring finally sent its first messenger, a wet smell in the wind, a blade of green, a drip that sounded like a clock remembering time, the body thawed slower than the fields. Pins and needles in spirit too. Smiles learned again, awkward as colts. Frostbite healed where it could, adapted where it must. Hands found new ways to tie knots. Feet learned different paths that didn't jar the place that still hurt. Hearts, cautiously, opened a window and let in the softest light. But no one forgot. Winter writes lessons deep. Cover the water bucket, bank the fire, share the middle, breathe through wool, count your fingers every night, count your blessings every morning. And if next year the cold comes hungrier, be ready with more straw, more soup, more songs, and the same stubborn promise, we will lose less of ourselves this time. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a hand held out to the hearth, cracked knuckles, a thumbnail nicked by work, steam rising from thawing wool. It is not a pretty hand. It is a good one. It has learned the cost of heat and the price of hope, and it keeps paying both, because that is what people did in the longest winters. They traded little pieces of themselves for the chance to keep the rest alive, not forever, just until morning. And somehow, morning kept coming. There's a kind of cold that seeps deeper than the skin, the kind that crawls in quietly, settles somewhere behind the ribs, and refuses to leave. By midwinter, every peasant knew that kind of cold, not just the chill in the air, but the one that lived inside you. The body adjusted first. You learned to move slower, to breathe through your nose, to ration warmth the way you rationed food. Each motion became deliberate, economical. You didn't waste energy. You couldn't afford to. The skin grew rough like bark, lips cracked, heels split. Even your hair felt brittle, as though it, too, had decided to hibernate. Every breath tasted faintly of smoke and iron. The scent of survival ground into your lungs like dust. You could tell the cold's progress by sound, the way wood groaned when the frost gripped it, the faint creak of the door frame as the air froze and swelled, the strange, almost musical crackle when the river iced over. Winter spoke a language you learned whether you wanted to or not, but the real damage wasn't what you could see. It was the creeping chill that slipped beneath the skin, the cold that took up residence in bones and stayed there long after spring. Old people carried winters in their joints like stories. You could tell their age not by wrinkles, but by how many times they'd shivered through December, knees that creaked, backs that bent, fingers that never quite straightened. These were not just signs of time, but of seasons survived. Children learned young that warmth was never a guarantee. They huddled close to the fire, small hands spread like petals, faces half orange, half shadow. Their laughter was thin, their cheeks flushed red with blood doing its best. When they coughed, it echoed, deep, wet, unstoppable. No one called it pneumonia. It was just the winter sickness, and you prayed it passed quickly. Inside the hut, warmth became both treasure and tyrant. The closer you sat to the fire, the hotter it burned your face, while your back froze at the same time. Turn too much, and the cold rushed in to claim the side you just thawed. It was a constant, clumsy dance, as if your own body couldn't remember which temperature it preferred. Smoke clung to everything, clothes, walls, lungs. The ceiling turned black, the beams slick with soot. Your eyes watered constantly, and you blinked through the blur, trying to believe it was cozy instead of toxic. Still, that smoke meant life. The air hurt more when it was clean. Food barely warmed you anymore. The stews were thin, the bread dense, the ale flat. Hunger was a quiet companion now, always sitting beside you, never leaving, just watching. When your stomach growled, it was a sign you were still alive. When it stopped, that was when people started to worry. The winter didn't kill suddenly. It wore you down slowly, politely. A little less strength each morning, a little less laughter each night. Until one day, you didn't feel cold anymore. And that was the worst sign of all. People learned to recognize that look, the stillness in someone's face, the quiet detachment that said the warmth was gone from within. Neighbors would whisper, "He's turning to ice." They meant it literally. If you drifted off to sleep too far from the fire, you might never wake. And if you did, your fingers might not forgive you. The cold wasn't dramatic. It was patient. It didn't conquer with storms, but with silence. Sometimes, the dead weren't buried right away. The ground was too hard to dig, so families wrapped their loved ones in cloth and set them in sheds or barns until the thaw. They didn't cry much, not out of cruelty, but because grief froze too. Tears came later, when the earth softened again. And yet, even in that relentless freeze, people found warmth in strange places. In laughter that broke out unexpectedly, the absurdity of life refusing to stop, in songs sung low by the fire, voices cracked but steady, in stories retold 100 times, each one more exaggerated, because exaggeration made you feel larger than your suffering. Hope became a habit, a performance you put on for each other to keep the cold from thinking it had won. Someone would say, "The snow will melt soon." Someone else would nod, even though it hadn't snowed yet that day. Belief itself was fuel. There was a saying whispered in some villages, "When the fire burns in your chest, the frost can't find you." It wasn't poetry, it was instruction. You learned to keep your inner fire, not metaphorically, but bodily, to keep moving, keep talking, keep caring about something, anything. The moment you stopped, the moment you grew still, the cold slipped in through the cracks of your spirit, and once it did, no blanket could fix it. Sometimes, to fight it, people danced, slowly, awkwardly, in cramped rooms, just enough to feel blood moving again. Old men clapped their hands near the fire, stomping in rhythm. Women hummed songs they barely remembered. Children twirled until dizziness replaced hunger. It wasn't joy. It was defiance disguised as music. There was no audience, no applause, just the sound of bodies insisting, "We are still alive." And then, after months of this frozen stubbornness, something small would change. The air would feel different, still cold, but lighter somehow. You'd step outside one morning and hear the faint dripping from the eaves. Water, real, running water. The frost on the trees began to glitter instead of cling. The snow softened, and the wind lost its knife's edge. And in that moment, every ache, every cough, every long night made sense, because you'd done it. You hadn't defeated the cold, no one ever did, but you'd endured it long enough for spring to remember you. So when people spoke of the cold getting inside, they didn't mean frostbite. They meant the temptation to give up, to stop fighting, to let the stillness take over. Survival was simple. Keep the body moving, keep the mind believing, keep the heart burning. And those who managed that, those who guarded their little spark against all odds, carried something back into spring that no chill could ever touch again. A quiet, unbreakable heat that lived far beneath the skin. It never announced itself. There was no trumpet, no sudden sunburst, no great exhale from heaven. The thaw crept in quietly, as if embarrassed to interrupt the cold. At first you didn't trust it. The air felt softer, yes, but softness was suspicious. You'd been fooled before. Winter liked to play tricks. A warm day here, a little blue sky there, then another storm to remind you who was in charge. But this time was different. The cold still bit, but it didn't own you anymore. Something in the wind had changed its mind. You noticed it in the details. The way the snow sagged instead of squeaked underfoot. The way the icicles on the roof began to drip, one by one, like a heartbeat restarting. The way smoke rose straighter from the chimney, as if the air had loosened its grip. For the first time in months, the world smelled like something: damp earth, thawing straw, the ghost of mud. After weeks of breathing, nothing but smoke and frost, that smell felt alive, indecently alive. Children stepped outside and laughed at puddles. They kicked the slush, marveled at the sound of dripping water, ran until their boots filled and their mothers shouted. Even the animals seemed confused, blinking at the strange liquid forming under their hooves, sniffing the air as if it might contain a promise. The thaw was messy. It always was. The pristine white world you'd stared at all winter dissolved into grey slush and filth. Every path turned to a river. Every wall wept. The huts that looked sturdy under frost now sagged with leaks and rot, and yet no one complained. Mud was mercy. Mud meant warmth was winning. You patched what you could, swept water out the door, and smiled at the absurdity of it all. Your home was dripping, your boots soaked, but the sound of melting ice was the sweetest music of the year. People emerged from their houses slowly, blinking like moles. Neighbors waved again, real waves, not the stiff nods exchanged through frost. Voices carried farther. Even laughter sounded different when it wasn't muffled by snow. You saw faces you hadn't seen since autumn, all thinner, paler, but unmistakably alive. There were fewer of them, there always were, yet the ones who remained smiled wider, as though surviving had made them slightly immortal. Someone always said it first, like a prayer, "It's breaking," and everyone knew what it meant, not just the ice, but the weight, the invisible heaviness that had pressed on every chest since November. It was lifting. Work began immediately. No one waited for celebration. Tools came out of hiding. Wood was chopped, fences repaired, animals led, blinking into the light. The thaw was a deadline, a short window before the floods, before the planting, before life demanded everything again. But for a few days, the work felt lighter. The ground was soft. The air smelled of beginnings, and even exhaustion felt blessed. The first patches of green appeared at the edges of the fields. Moss, grass, weeds, who cared? Anything not white was a miracle. Children picked them as though they were flowers. The fire inside the house burned differently now, less desperate, more companionable. You didn't huddle before it. You sat near it. You didn't beg it for life. You thanked it for company. At night, you slept without wrapping your head in wool. The air still had bite, but it didn't feel like an enemy anymore. Dreams changed too. They stopped being about warmth and food and started being about fields and sun. Spring wasn't here yet, but she was coming, and you could feel her. A low hum in the soil, a vibration underfoot, a whisper through the thawing reeds. With the melting came the counting. Every family did it. Who had made it? Who hadn't? Names were spoken softly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with weary pride. The Lord took her in the hard frost. He held on till the feast of St. Bridget. There was grief, yes, but it wasn't heavy. It felt accepted, as if each death was part of a contract everyone had signed long ago. You built again. You mended again. The cycle rolled forward, slow but unstoppable. The same story, told every year, but never exactly the same cast. When the snow finally vanished from the fields, people went out barefoot just to feel the earth again. It was still cold, still wet, but it was real, not a dream of white silence, but the living dirt itself. They pressed their souls into it, grinning through their teeth. Some even wept, not from sadness, from release. And in that moment, the land forgave you. The air forgave you. Even winter, cruel as it was, seemed to sigh and retreat, leaving behind only its memory, a long scar across the season that somehow made the beauty of spring feel earned. The thaw didn't erase what had been. It didn't heal the frostbitten hands or refill the cupboards, but it did something quieter, more profound. It reminded everyone that suffering had an end, that nothing, not even the cold, was forever. And when the first raindrop hit the roof, soft and warm and liquid, you could almost hear the land itself whispering, "You did it. You endured." The first true spring day never arrived all at once. It slipped in, gentle as a thief, while the world was still shivering in its sleep. But one morning, you woke, and the air felt different, lighter, sweeter, as if someone had opened a window inside the sky. The cold didn't vanish. It simply forgot to stay. You could still see your breath, but it no longer frightened you. Frost sparkled on the grass like a farewell, melting before noon. The birds returned, clumsy and loud, as if surprised they'd survived the journey. And when you stepped outside, your bones, stiff, sore, suspicious, began to remember how to belong to warmth again. It wasn't fast. Bodies thaw slower than rivers. Your hands, cracked from months of cold, didn't trust the sun at first. They opened hesitantly, palm by palm, like flowers testing the light. But when that light touched them, real sunlight, golden and weightless, it felt like forgiveness. The village changed in color first. The roofs lost their winter gray. The mud turned to a soft, hopeful brown. Tiny shoots poked through the thawed fields, stubborn as prayer. Children followed them, pointing and laughing like they'd found treasure. Everyone moved differently now, looser, faster, with the wild rhythm of people who'd been half dead and just remembered how to live. Laughter came easier. So did work. You could swing an axe without your breath turning to ice, carry water without fear it would freeze between well and door. Even the animals seemed reborn. The cows lowed louder. The hens strutted like royalty. The pigs rolled in mud as though testing the new season's flavor. For months, you'd lived inside smoke and darkness. Now light poured into every crack, unapologetic, filling the room with gold. You almost wanted to weep at the sight of dust floating in sunlight. Proof that the air could hold warmth again. With spring came labor, endless, blessed labor. Fields needed turning, seeds needed sowing, tools needed mending. You worked until your muscles screamed, and still you smiled, because exhaustion in the sun felt cleaner than rest by the fire ever had. Winter had been survival, spring was resurrection. Each seed dropped into the earth felt like a promise whispered back to time. We're still here. We still believe. You knelt in the dirt, the same dirt that had frozen you, starved you, humbled you, and pressed your hands into it with reverence. The soil was cold, but alive. It accepted the seed without question, the way it always did. Faith didn't need to be spoken anymore. It was planted. At night, people lingered outside longer, staring at stars they hadn't seen in months. The darkness no longer frightened them. It was just the space between one good day and the next. The fires burned lower now, not from desperation, but from contentment. You didn't huddle close. You sat back, let the air touch your skin, and realized that warmth, real warmth, didn't have to come from flame anymore. The body remembered how to be light again, how to stretch, how to laugh without coughing, how to breathe without seeing it. And beneath that comfort came a quiet ache, not pain, but awareness, that what you'd survived had changed you. The frost had taken its toll, a missing finger, a lingering cough, a roof still patched from collapse, but the survivors carried a kind of calm you couldn't fake. The calm of people who'd faced death and learned it was patient, but not infinite. When someone complained about the mud, others smiled. Mud meant life. Mud meant progress. Mud meant that the cold, no matter how long or merciless, had lost again. The festivals returned. The first bread baked from new grain, the first song sung outside without trembling, the first child born under clear skies. Each one celebrated not for grandeur, but for continuity. Someone would strum a lute, someone else would dance badly, the rest would clap along. Ale spilled, smoke rose, laughter echoed down the same valley that had been silent all winter. The land itself seemed to hum, and though they didn't say it aloud, everyone knew. They were dancing for the dead too, for the ones who hadn't seen the thaw, for the ones whose names still hung like frost in memory. The joy wasn't denial, it was inheritance. By mid-spring, the cold felt like a distant dream. You'd catch yourself standing in sunlight, eyes closed, smiling for no reason. Maybe you'd press a palm to your chest, feeling the steady beat there, the same heart that had slowed almost to stillness in January, now thudding like it wanted to make up for lost time. And you'd think, without words, the warmth came back. It always comes back. In that truth, there was peace. The seasons would turn again. Cruel, kind, cruel again, and so would life. But you knew now that nothing, not even the longest night or the coldest wind, could last forever. The fire you tended all winter, the one you thought might die, was still burning, smaller, steadier, inside you. It would outlast every frost to come, and as the sky blushed pink over the thawed fields, and the first birds began their clumsy songs, you could almost hear the earth whispering through the meltwater. Rest now. You've done enough. The world remembers you,